Good morning and welcome everyone to WCL. We're very happy to have you here today to join us for this incredibly informative and timely panel. Thank you for making it out to the first panel of the day. I know that can be difficult sometimes. This panel will frame the Iraqi refugee crisis in the global context. Just last month, Walter Kalin, the UN independent expert on internally displaced persons, issued a report to the UN Human Rights Council in which he called for increased global attention to the plight of internally displaced persons worldwide. More than 26 million people are internally displaced as a result of armed violence or conflict, with most of those internally displaced being located in Sudan, Colombia, and Iraq. The panelists in this panel are going to provide a little more context as to the plight of Iraqi internally displaced persons in different regions of the world. In the interest of time, seeing as how we're already running a bit late, I'll just briefly mention the current position of each of our speakers and the order in which they'll speak. But please find their complete bios located in your packets in the registration materials. So first, we will hear from Michel Gabadon, the regional representative for the U.S. and Caribbean. He's the UN High Commissioner, or he works at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees as the U.S. and Caribbean representative, and he's trained as a medical doctor. Next, we will hear from Abdurrahim Sabir, who is the acting spokesperson and project leader for the Civilian Protection Initiative for the Middle East and North Africa at Human Rights Watch. After Abdurrahim, we will then hear from Bill Freilich. Bill is the director of the Refugee Policy Program at Human Rights Watch and issued a very recent report, an excellent report on asylum seekers and migrants in Greece and Turkey. Next, we will hear from Barbara Strack, who is the Chief of Refugee Affairs Division at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and has been there since November of 2005. And finally, we will hear from Kirk Johnson, who is the founder and director of the LIST project, a very innovative project in which he has brought together over 100 attorneys from 2 leading law firms to offer thousands of hours of pro bono representation for Iraqi refugees on his list, and he's cultivated a nationwide grassroots support effort. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our first speaker. Each of our speakers will have about 10 minutes in which to speak, and then we hope to save the remainder of our time for a robust discussion with all of you. So, Michel?
Thank you very much, Mitalia. Good morning, everyone. If I take as a starting point the discussion we had a year ago on this Iraqi refugee conference, I would like to introduce my few comments by the address that our director for the Middle East made to our standing committee a few weeks ago by saying that we are now living a transition phase where the focus is moving slowly away from the asylum countries and more into Iraq. And what I would like to do is to, like all transition phases, they are very delicate, they're sensitive, they present opportunities that we have to try to exploit to the maximum, but they still represent a series of major challenges for which we don't necessarily have found all the answers. So there are some changed circumstances which I would like to go over first, and then I will cover what the challenges are and how we expect to respond to these in the coming year. The changed circumstances are the following. In Iraq, we have seen the beginning of returns last year. It's reckoned that 195,000 IDPs went back home and that about 25,000 refugees went back home, mostly from Syria. These are those who deregistered. But what we are observing since the last months of last year, and it's consolidated now, is an increasing number of people who leave asylum countries, some for a short time, and that we're not too worried because they just go and see and come back and say, no, I want to stay in asylum. But we have an increasing number who seem to us to be leaving for quite a bit of time, and that might indicate that they're not finding as many difficulties as they expected. And parallel to that, we have an increase of what we call no-shows in our assistance distribution systems in asylum countries. It's still very low. It's below 10%, but I mean it's increasing. And these are registration system is so tight in Iraq that you can't leave and give your card to someone else and someone will use it. So people who are not there, basically, it shows very quickly in our monitoring of the assistance. So all these are indications that some people are starting looking back home. There has been a consolidation of the political process in Iraq. It's undoubted. There was growing confidence of the government, including a growing consensus among different government ministries on the fact that they have to look at the return of refugees as something positive. This was certainly not the case a year ago, and we have seen progress, at least in the rhetoric, over the last year. And I think this is very, very good news. And we have seen also a growing recognition of the Iraqi government by the neighboring states, which is also very, very good news. The governor has progressed in the instrument he has put to help returnees in terms of legislation for compensation on the housing. It has allocated funds for the returns, and we consider this moves also that point to the right direction. And we have ourselves moved some of our staff away from asylum countries where they try to manage the Iraqi situation back to Baghdad to get a much closer relationship with the government and be able to enter into meaningful negotiations how to prepare for returns. In neighboring countries, there have been some consolidation of the asylum space in that we don't have this year the difficulties perhaps we faced a year and a half ago on arrest, threats of deportations, etc. This has sort of gone down. We have so far registered about 310,000 refugees in both Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, a much smaller number. And we have so far submitted for resettlement to third countries 54,000 refugees, including a bit over 40,000 to the U.S. And close to 23,000 of these 54,000 have left for resettlement. So this is in terms of the positive changes, if you want, both in Iraq and in the neighboring asylum countries. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is rosy. I mean, I think Michel explained very clearly what are the challenges for those who find themselves in asylum. Consolidation of the protection space doesn't mean that their socioeconomic status, that their anxiety, that the distress they live in have been solution. Far from that. In Iraq, the positive trends that I have mentioned in terms of legislation, allocation of funds, do not necessarily materialize in the field. The assistance that the government provides is still not effective for returnees. While the security situation in general has improved, there is no doubt, the human rights situation remains a source of major concern for us. In the surveys we have made of the returnees, some of the positive trends we have observed, like the fact that more children are enrolled into schooling back into Iraq than it was the case last year, that more public servants are getting back their job, that less people complain about protection problems than last year when they return. On the negative side, I would say that still 53% regret their decision to have returned. And I think that explains why we have so many who leave Syria in particular without deregistering. They go back, but they don't want to risk losing their entitlement. So we are in a sort of gray zone where they are testing the waters. It's also important to state that in our surveys, over 30% of those who return have not managed to go back to their intended place of return. And their intended place of return is not necessarily where they came back from initially. So there is a major shift in their possibility to resume their life where they expected. Access remains for us a major difficulty. We work inside Iraq through our national staff who are working under very difficult odds, and they themselves do not necessarily think it's in their service to advertise widely in their neighborhood that they work for the UN. So that to us is a clear indication that access is going to remain for quite some time a serious constraint for us. And to leave the international zone from Baghdad, you still have to make applications a long time in advance, etc. So our ability to respond very practically in Iraq remains difficult. We have one issue as a refugee agency, of course, which is to address the problem of refugees in Iraq. The most sensitive one is the one that Michel mentioned, that of the Palestinians. There are over 30,000 Palestinian refugees in Iraq, a few thousand of whom live in camps that are absolutely unacceptable in the no man's land between Iraq and neighboring states. And funding has remained a problem. Last year, the U.S. funded 67% of our appeal. So far, our appeal for this year has been met only to the extent of 30% of the demands, and that includes an 80% contribution of the U.S. for that. So there's still big difficulties to convince donors to step up to the plate, if I may say, and help in these processes. So very briefly, how do we expect to address the challenges? We will have to play a very careful balance of maintaining the asylum space in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, and insisting with our donors that refugees need continuing and developing aid in these countries, and these asylum countries need still to be supported. But at the same time, we have to increase what we are doing in Iraq. And of course, this is not a very appealing proposal we're making to donors, which is to say we've got now to be present and increase our activities in both countries. We have to try to stabilize return both by building up a confidence measure with communities in Iraq. We have started last year by having a shelter program in different areas of Baghdad, for example, some Sunni areas, some Shia areas, to try to show that we can help at the community level. And that experience has been positive. It has been a very moderate one so far, but we are planning to extend this considerably. And we want to continue our work with the government in helping the government to make their assistance effective. The High Commissioner, when he was recently in Iraq, have suggested to the government to establish what we call one counter does it all center to receive returnees, whether they are IDPs or refugees, where property restitution, registration to the public distribution system, renewal of ID documents, enrollment of children in school, settlement of pension issues when applicable, etc., can all be dealt with in the same center. The problem the people who return now have is that they have to address their needs in so many different places that they lose track of that. The government was responsive to that, but we have to make this operational. And we're trying to establish 8 centers inside Baghdad to help returnees. We must be very clear that Baghdad holds the key to the returns of about 75% of the IDPs and perhaps just a slightly lower percentage of the refugees. So what we can do within Baghdad would be key to consolidate that process. I think I've passed my time, so I'll leave it here and address questions if there are some later. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Abdurrahim Sabir.
Thank you. I'm speaking here actually on behalf of, well, not on behalf of anyone, but Bill will be speaking on behalf of Human Rights Watch. So I'm speaking about the experience that I had when doing research on refugees in Jordan and Syria with UNAMI, with the UN mission in Iraq. The mission came about when, for a number of reasons. One of them was that both offices that we had in Baghdad and Erbil didn't have access to people to go and interview victims and talk to them and find out what was going on in Iraq. So the thinking was that we should probably start reaching out to refugees and finding out what kind of violations they've fall victim to, and what led to them leaving the country. So these are the questions that we had to raise with the Iraqi refugees. By September, the early September, we worked on developing the work plan for the mission, and we started the mission in Jordan by early September and had spent 2 weeks in Syria the last 2 weeks of September 2007. Some of the findings that we came across were very interesting because unlike many refugee situations where you find one group, one ethnic group or one religious group, the Iraqis that we met with and interviewed belong to all sectarian groups in Iraq. So we found Shia and Sunni Arabs, we found Christians, Turkmen, some of Shia Kurds, some of the Sunni Kurds, and these groups have been victimized by groups and armed groups and militias that belong to the same sectarian groups. I remember one of the slogans that when in the war in Algeria in the 1990s that we used to say, who is targeting whom? And this slogan could be said about Iraq. I mean, everyone was involved in what happened to this and led to Iraqis fleeing their homes. Most of the people that we talked to either received direct threats whereby some of their family members were abducted and compensation was asked. Some of their family members disappeared. They received letters in their homes or in their workplace, or indirect threats. Some of them heard from friends or neighbors that they should leave the neighborhood. They're not anymore wanted and that they run the risk of being killed. Or they just saw an escalation of the violence within their own neighborhoods. And they have young kids and they were afraid. They didn't pack up. Most of them didn't pack and leave for Syria or Jordan. Most of them packed and left within Iraq. So some of them went to their family members, some of them went to stay with friends, and moved within Iraq for a couple of times, sometimes 3 times, before deciding that they have to leave the country, that the threat has become more serious, and that they continue to receive the threat, and they have to leave the country. So they ended up leaving the country for either Syria or Jordan, or other places like Egypt and Lebanon. Some of them knew where the threat came from. They will say this group was the one behind the threat. Some of them guessed that, well, this militia, I think that this militia is the one that is behind this threat. Some of them don't know where the threat came from. They can only assume that it's probably this group or that group. All they know is that the threat was serious, and they have to take it seriously and leave somewhere within Iraq or leave the country somewhere else. So the fear was absolutely genuine, and in terms of the groups themselves, you can find the majority was lower middle class, and because the very poor Iraqis are the ones that were displaced internally. But there are a lot of them were low middle class, and there are some of them, not a lot, but some of them that are well-to-do. And you can see that in neighborhoods in Syria or in Jordan, for example. You can see them in Amman, where they are living, but you can see a lot of them also living in Hayy Sahab. For those who know Amman, they will know that it's an extremely poor area in Jordan. The unfortunate thing is very little. Then I left in February 2008. I left the mission in Iraq. But then when we were conducting the research, very little was done for the Iraqis. A lot of them are you find the men staying at home for the entire day. In Jordan, for example, due to the fear of being picked by the police, Jordanian police, and maybe being forced to return back to Iraq. There were problems that have to do with schooling their own children, and that's a problem that we encountered in Jordan more than in Syria. There were problems of socializing within the country itself, where they are blamed by both communities for the rise of the prices. They feel that they brought that on themselves. They feel that average Jordanians and Syrians feel that if they're not doing well in their lives, it has to do with the refugees and the flood of refugees that came, Iraqi refugees. And a lot of Iraqis felt that countries like Jordan benefited from Iraq for many years, and they felt that this is not a way to treat them within the country. There were problems that have to do also with registering Iraqis in Syria and Jordan. A lot of them, especially with the majority that is either poor or lower middle class, didn't have the means to go to the HCR offices and register. So very few of them were registered with HCR. And unfortunately then, HCR didn't have a lot of staff, and were not moving within the neighborhood and going to meet with refugees and register them. It is, when you look at it in terms of refugees somewhere else, and they worked with refugees in Darfurians in Chad, for example, where they are all in camps, and you can go and meet with them and talk to them and so on. It's not the case with Iraqis. They live in certain neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are in different areas, and to be able to reach out to them and register them was almost was extremely tough. But the feeling then was that definitely more could have been done to make it much easier for them to register in these countries. The numbers of those that were registered was very low. That's at least from the statistic that we got when we were doing our research in both Jordan and Syria. Still, the Iraqi government bears tremendous responsibility, because they were doing very, very little toward Iraqis in Syria and Jordan. And I'm not sure that policy has changed. We have received then delegations of Iraqi parliamentarians, and a lot of them talked about a percentage of the oil, for example, being spent on the refugees to help the refugees abroad, but very little has been done. Okay.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Bill Freilich.
Thank you very much. The research that we conducted last year and the report that we wrote focuses on Europe, and I want to spend a minute to just say, why it is we decided to take that look. People said, well, how many Iraqis are in Greece and Turkey, after all, when there are hundreds of thousands in Syria and Jordan? But we did a series of reports, actually. 2006, we did a report called Nowhere to Flee about the Palestinians coming out of Iraq, but obviously with the title Nowhere to Flee, they weren't exactly coming out of Iraq. We then had a report in late 2006 called The Silent Treatment about Iraqis in Jordan. Again, I think the title was very revealing. At that time, they were virtually invisible. In 2007, we issued a report called From a Flow to a Trickle about the cutoff of people trying to escape Iraq into Syria, Jordan, Egypt at that time. And later that year, late 2007 in December, we issued a report on Iraqis in Lebanon called Rot Here or Die There, about Iraqis who were being held in detention and given the horrible choice of remaining in indefinite detention in overcrowded cells in Lebanon, or choosing, quote unquote, to return to Baghdad. And so in 2008, we decided to look at what has actually been a growing phenomenon, and that is when you look at the European Union over the course of the last 3 years, you see that the largest nationality groups seeking asylum in the European Union are in fact Iraqis. And that the number from 2006 to 2007 doubled from about 20,000 to 40,000. And so while, relative to the proximate neighboring countries, it may not be large numbers, in terms of the international burden sharing, international response, it's actually quite significant. When you think back to Michelle's presentation at the beginning this morning, where she talked about the 5 or so different avenues for Iraqis to come to the United States, just knock off the last 4 from that list with respect to the European Union, it's only asylum. And so what we wanted to focus on was access to asylum. People, do they even have the opportunity to lodge an asylum claim in the European Union? And what I wanted to look at, and one of the things that we noted at the outset as a problem, is that when we looked at the statistics from 2006, we were seeing that, for 2007, we were seeing that even though Iraqis represented the largest nationality group seeking asylum in the European Union, in fact, 2 countries represented 62% of all the claims. Only 2 countries, and those 2 countries are Sweden and Greece. And, we sort of looked at what do Sweden and Greece have in common? Why would this be the case? Well, as we looked at it, what we decided, that was for 2007, is that in 2006, the year before, Sweden had an approval rate for Iraqis of 91%. So we said, okay, that makes sense. Okay, that's in the self-interest of an asylum seeker to go to the place where you have the best chance of being granted asylum. But so then we looked at the asylum approval rate in Greece. And what did we find? We found a big fat 0. 0. Not a single person had been granted asylum in Greece. So we were thinking, well, why on earth would they go there? Why are such large numbers of asylum seekers applying in Greece? And what we found out was that they have no other choice. According to the Dublin Convention and the regulations that come out of that, which set up the rules for which country in a member state of the European Union is responsible for examining an asylum claim, we discovered that the rule, basically, with a few exceptions, is based on the country of first entry. And if you looked at a map, and if I had the foresight to bring a map to show you, you could easily see that for Iraqis coming by land, coming by sea, Greece is the entry point to the European Union. So what we found was that there's become an effort on the part of the Greeks to avoid this responsibility that they've shouldered according to the rules that are set up by the European Union. And interestingly enough, as we go ahead and we look at the statistics going into 2008, we see, in fact, that Sweden reacted in the first quarter of 2008, their asylum approval rate dropped to 25% to show that, hey, we don't want to be the generous one that people come to. And Greece, in fact, as you'll see in the report that we issued, tightened and ratcheted up the deterrent measures to keep people out. The title of this last report is called Stuck in a Revolving Door. And it's really people that are not able to find protection, not able to lodge claims, and are being pushed sort of around and around and around. And the revolving door you can look at in a number of different ways. The revolving door within the European Union of sending people back to Greece, the revolving door between Greece and Turkey with people being pushed back and forth across that border, and in a sense the revolving door within Greece itself of an asylum system that's completely dysfunctional, and a detention system that puts people into detention and then releases them from detention and then re-detains them and then releases them and re-detains them. They've got nowhere to go. So let me jump into what we did in this study. We conducted 173 detailed interviews of migrants, asylum seekers, refugees in both Greece and Turkey. 79 of them were Iraqis. 126 of the interviews took place in Greece. 46 took place in Turkey. Interviews lasted generally around an hour. And in each case, we made it very clear to the person that we were interviewing that they would receive no benefit, no service, nothing in return for their testimony. Testimonies were completely confidential, with no one else listening, and we promised to maintain the confidentiality of all the names. And what we found among that group were 41 testimonies of people that we interviewed both in Greece and in Turkey, in detention centers and in Athens and in different places, who testified in a remarkably similar way about the experience of having been apprehended in Greek territory in the region of the Evros River, the land crossing point between Greece and Turkey, having been held for a matter of days, sometimes as long as a week, in police stations in Greece, in Greek territory, without being registered, without being fingerprinted, and then being put into trucks, buses, under armed guard at night, taken to the river, taken to the border with Turkey, and with kicks and punches and threats when the Turkish guards were no longer present, being pushed across the river into Turkey. As I said, 41 testimonies, 41 accounts of this happening, very, very similar experience of people from very diverse points that we interviewed them. And so we believe that this is actually a systematic practice that's happening at the border. We actually found some statistics from the Turkish gendarme, the border authorities there. They even have a category for people illegally pushed across. They had a number of 12,000 that they had counted over the course of a couple of years. We think that's actually a low number because, again, most of these people are pushed over when the Turkish guards are not there, and so many of them do evade capture on the other side. We also interviewed people who had the experience of going on boats, people that we interviewed in the Greek islands and, of course, in Athens and in Turkey as well, that told of the experience of having being interdicted in the waters. There isn't much in the way of international waters. Those of you who have been on some of the Greek islands, you can actually look across and see the Turkish coastline from where you're sitting. But they would be interdicted by the Greek Coast Guard, and their boats would be disabled. If they were in a rubber raft, they would puncture holes in the raft. If they had an engine, the engine would be taken off and thrown into the water. They might be given just an oar pointed in that direction and pushed over. We saw in both Greece and Turkey, we saw really horrible conditions of detention. I had the opportunity of spending 2 days, two full days in the Tunca detention facility in Edirne in western Turkey. I think we were the first NGOs to have access to that facility. I'm not even sure that UNHCR had been inside. It was just horrible. People held indefinitely for months and months and months, never let outside, even for an hour or a week or anything. I mean, people that had been there for months and had never been outside of a small room with 400 men in it that is basically closed and locked off with no controls inside the room whatsoever. We had testimonies of beatings and mistreatment in Greek, the police stations, jails, the airport where the returnees under the Dublin II are sent back. We looked at the asylum system, we looked at asylum interviews in Greece, and found a complete breakdown. Last year, the asylum approval rate in the first instance for Iraqis continued to be zero, absolute zero, not a single Iraqi recognized as a refugee. And they have, even though supposedly in the European Union, they have directives that harmonize the asylum, the standards that you need to meet to qualify for asylum, and for something called subsidiary protection, the idea that if you're fleeing from armed conflict, you also are deserving of protection. That category doesn't even exist in the Greek categories of protection. They have 26,000 cases that are currently in their backlog for appeal. They only listen to 60 cases per week. So when you do the math, it's going to take them 8 years just to go through the existing backlog. And given that everyone is denied in the first instance, that backlog is obviously likely to grow. What needs to be done? Europe needs to to, in fact, not just on paper, harmonize its asylum procedures. Last year, asylum statistics for Iraqis had a 100% approval rate in Finland, 0% in Greece. That can't be the case when you have harmonized asylum standards and procedures. And then, of course, reception conditions, detention. What's on paper, again, as a harmonized system with EC directives coming out of Brussels is simply not being followed in Greece, and I think all the other member states of the European Union have been happy to look the other way, as they've been able to look the other way with respect to the abuses and the refoulement that's occurring at the border with Turkey. So there has to be not just a reform of the asylum system itself and much greater self-monitoring by the European Union about its own member states, but the Dublin II regulation based on the Dublin Convention needs to be changed because the system that's been set up is completely unfair to those countries like Malta and Greece that are on the periphery of the European Union, and the burden, and it is a burden, needs to be equitably shared among the member states of the European Union. And I think that will enable Europe to begin to play a more useful role in terms of international broader burden sharing, the development of a refugee resettlement policy, which has been non-existent up until now, and much more engagement in the region as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Next, we'll hear from Barbara Strack.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to join you all this morning. My presentation, I think, is a little bit different than those that have gone before. The other speakers have been, I think, describing quite eloquently the situation and the needs of refugees in various locations and internally displaced persons inside Iraq. There's clearly no single solution to the myriad needs that have been described and that coexist. But in my remarks, I'm going to focus on one solution for some refugees, and that's the option of refugee resettlement in the United States. As many of you know, the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program is a shared responsibility between the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security. I work for one of the subsidiary components of DHS, that's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and we are the division within DHS that is charged with working with the State Department on refugee resettlement to the United States. Collectively, the goal of our program this year, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, is to resettle a minimum of 17,000 Iraqi refugees to the United States. We may very well resettle more than 17,000, but we established that as a minimum for the fiscal year 2009. So that's starting October 1st through September 30th. This is a substantial increase over the number resettled last year, which was just over 13,800. We had set a goal for ourselves of 12,000 admissions last year, and we were able to exceed that. Now, we are admitting these Iraqi refugees in the context of a worldwide program. And the worldwide program as well is growing. We're shooting for, we expect to resettle about 75,000 refugees worldwide. So while we're working with Iraqis, we're continuing to work to resettle Burmese refugees, for example, from Thailand and Malaysia. We're resettling Bhutanese from Nepal. But those three groups for this year, Iraqis, Bhutanese, and Burmese, represent the largest portion of the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. There are many other nationalities involved at lower levels. Now, I realize full well that these numbers probably sound modest in comparison to the other numbers you've been hearing this morning in terms of the situation with refugees and IDPs. So I'd like to address that briefly. The first thing that I think is important to remember is that the U.S. refugee resettlement really had no infrastructure, no meaningful infrastructure at all in the region until about 2 years ago. A significant amount of the Iraqi involvement in the U.S. resettlement program really began in February 2007. And some of you may remember it was actually it was Valentine's Day 2007. The UN High Commissioner and the State Department announced that the United States would be accepting 7,000 referrals of Iraqi refugees. And at that time, not to steal Michelle's portfolio, really UNHCR did not have the infrastructure to do a high level of referrals. The State Department's administrative infrastructure, the OPEs, had no meaningful operations in Amman or Damascus. USCIS had not been sending officers. So really, what started in February 2007 was a ratcheting up of capacity. And that means everything from identifying a building where you can work, leasing the building, hiring staff, training staff, putting in IT systems, all those sort of very mundane things that it takes to run an operation like this. What's happened is that is now all in place, really, in the locations where we need it. So we've really institutionalized Iraqi refugee processing, and that is why there were very substantial increases in the number of Iraqi refugee admissions from 2007, when it was on the order of 1,600, to over 13,800 last year, shooting for 17,000 or hopefully more for 2009. Our USCIS officers now work regularly in Amman, Damascus, Cairo, Beirut, Istanbul, and now Baghdad is one of our regular locations. We are interviewing substantially more Iraqi applicants, refugee applicants this year compared to last year. In the first quarter of the fiscal year, so that's October, November, December, we more than doubled the number of Iraqi applicants who we had interviewed compared with the year before. We don't have the numbers yet for this fiscal quarter. The second quarter ends at the end of this month. But again, it will be a very, very dramatic increase beyond the numbers that were interviewed at the same time last year. As of last week, over 6,500 Iraqi refugees had been admitted to the U.S. this fiscal year. Those of you who are familiar with the Refugee Admissions Program probably know the typical pattern is that admissions are not distributed evenly over the course of the fiscal year. It typically is backloaded for the fiscal year. So in fact, 6,500 is a very substantial down payment on reaching our 17,000, given that the fourth quarter of the fiscal year is usually when we see the largest numbers of admissions. So now again, having said all that, I want to say full well that we realize that resettlement alone is not going to solve the problem of Iraqi refugees. But this really isn't unusual in the resettlement world. That resettlement is ordinarily a small part of the solution for refugee situations numerically. And it is part of a comprehensive approach that includes assistance and protection in host countries, and eventually, obviously, we all hope, conditions that will permit the voluntary return of refugees to Iraq on a voluntary basis when conditions are appropriate, and for those who choose to avail themselves of that situation. Let me talk briefly about who these refugees are who are being resettled in the United States. They primarily come to our program in two ways. The primary criteria has been UNHCR referrals, and UNHCR uses 11 criteria to identify the vulnerable refugees who they think are most appropriate for resettlement. But increasingly, more refugees are also coming to the U.S. resettlement program through the so-called Priority 2 or P2 program, which is basically a way for some refugees to approach the United States directly without having passed through the UNHCR registration process first. The P2 program includes people who've worked directly for the U.S. government and for U.S. contractors, as well as for U.S.-based media organizations and NGOs, and also for family members of those employees, because we do know that in addition to those kinds of direct employees, that the perceived taint that those employees have in the eyes of some can extend to their family members. And so the P2 takes recognition of that and extends to certain family members. The P2 program is currently running in Iraq and in Jordan and in Egypt. The reason it's in those three countries and not more broadly is that a P2 program requires the cooperation of the host government. And so those are the governments who will cooperate with us. In certain other countries, they insist that UNHCR be involved as the front end for the refugee resettlement program. I'll turn briefly, many of you may know how the process works, but there To oversimplify a little bit, there's basically a division of labor between the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security. The State Department decides in the first instance which refugees have access to the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, and USCIS officers from my program are responsible for deploying around the world and interviewing refugee applicants on a case-by-case basis and determining whether they qualify for resettlement in the United States. And State Department also runs the administrative infrastructure for the U.S. refugee resettlement worldwide through the overseas processing entities. Many of you may be familiar with the OPEs. We share the responsibility with the State Department for conducting background checks on refugee applicants. And I would like to just talk about that briefly for a moment. Iraqi refugee applicants, like all refugee applicants, are subject to some background screening checks. We run checks on names and we run checks on fingerprints. And in fact, that's true for most domestic immigration applicants as well. USCIS is responsible for the fingerprint part of the process. And this has been working very well. We get results back in 2 to 4 weeks from the time we collect the fingerprints. And because we are able to run that process concurrently with certain other steps of the process, it does not add time overall to the time it takes to process a case unless there is some sort of a derogatory hit. But one thing I did want to talk to you about is the fact that we have learned over the last 2 years since the program began that there are bad actors who are trying to gain access to the United States through the refugee program. I will say that the numbers, the absolute numbers, are very, very small, but the individual instances are serious. And so we feel it's, well, I want to emphasize that it's really, this is not a speculative or a theoretical risk. It is something that we have seen. So in order to maintain a robust resettlement program for Iraqi refugees and to make sure it's not distorted by people who are trying to use the system for other purposes other than intended humanitarian purposes, we think it's very important that, that this the security vetting be continued and be robust. Now, I don't mean to suggest that we slow things down. It's been our experience to date that we can be doing state-of-the-art security checks and processing Iraqi refugees for resettlement more quickly than we're processing refugees of any other nationality in the world. I know time is short, and Ambassador Foley will be talking to you on the next panel and giving a little more description from the State Department's perspective, the U.S. government's perspective on the program. So what I'd like to say in closing is just assure you that the Iraqi resettlement program has been and continues to be an enormous priority for the Department of Homeland Security. It's true here at the Washington level. It's true in the field. I have had dozens of officers who work for me volunteer to go to Baghdad in order to make the in-country program work. And we appreciate how important this work is. We are committed to working closely, continuing to work closely with the State Department and the UNHCR to make it a meaningful solution for qualified refugees.
Thank you, Barbara. And our final speaker will be Kirk Johnson.
Thanks for having me. And it's an honor to be on this panel. Michelle and Michelle has personally helped with a number of cases, as has Barbara, and they've been putting up with our team of lawyers from the different law firms that are trying to help the Iraqis who have helped us. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to really abbreviate these comments because I think we probably want to answer some questions too, and I've heard myself speak more than I ever want to in my life. My focus on this crisis is on the Iraqis who have become endangered because of their affiliation with the United States in Iraq. I used to work for USAID in 2005 in Baghdad and Fallujah, and in that process befriended a lot of our Iraqi staff who, after I left, began receiving death threats, and several of my colleagues have been assassinated because they worked with USAID. And it's true that at the time that I got involved, it didn't seem like there was much in the way of processing that was going on. There were months where a single Iraqi would a single person would be admitted into this country. And so by that metric, there have been huge strides in the last couple of years. And I think Ambassador Foley, Ambassador Shalaba, actually, she's not an ambassador, is she? No. I always make that mistake. Special advisor. There are a lot of people in the government that have been working very hard on this issue, and the numbers have been climbing. From my perspective, I can't believe that we couldn't do better if we had the investment of the White House, and I think that from my perspective, that's been the key missing link throughout all of this. We have moved refugees in vastly greater numbers in our past, and 2 years ago it was very impolitic to talk about the Vietnamese refugees because it seemed linked with failure and withdrawal, and that the dynamics have changed now. We all know that we're scaling down in Iraq. But in 75, I think we moved something in the order of 130 or 140,000 Vietnamese in a matter of months. In 96, which is, I think, a pertinent precedent that a lot of people have forgotten about, there were a group of Iraqis in the north of Iraq that were, in many cases, seemed to be U.S. affiliated, and Saddam was moving his forces north, and President Clinton at the time surveyed the traditional resettlement process and realized that they wouldn't be able to work quickly enough to actually move these people, these Iraqis, out and save them. And so what he ordered was something called Operation Pacific Haven, which in the course of a few weeks tasked the military to fly these Iraqis to our base in Guam. And average processing time there in Guam was 90 to 120 days. And those Iraqis are now American. I mean, they're now Americans, and they live here. From my perspective, I don't see why we can't do something like this again for the Iraqis who have helped us. These are among the most documented refugees in the world. A lot of them the ones that worked with me at USAID and with State and as interpreters with the military, went through routine polygraph examinations and have badges, and I'm not naive enough to suggest that every single one of them is a saint. But I don't think that we can let ourselves become prisoners of uncertainty on that front. I think it's relevant to reflect that our greatest allies in Iraq, the Brits, the Danes, the Poles, and I believe the Australians, have all conducted airlifts on their own of their Iraqi staffs. And the Brits have been flying Iraqis directly to Oxfordshire, to one of their military bases in the UK, where they're doing processing there. I think, from my perspective, what we call the Guam option, people, I've been told that I'm crazy for proposing this, and I probably am, but I can't operate without pursuing that. I think that this poses the best option for helping those who have helped us, and that obviously doesn't meet our greater responsibility to the rest of the refugee crisis, but from my focus, I'm looking at those who have helped us. What it would do is it would take the Iraqis out of harm's way and at the same time keep the American public safe by processing them in a place that's off of our soil and away from the public. And it's not really a novel idea. It's something that's done regularly. I think that there are positive signs with the new administration, and we now have a president who's spoken quite powerfully about our moral and strategic obligations to help these particular Iraqis. I don't think there's been, I don't think the administration has gotten around to really formulating or articulating their policy on this issue yet, and I could be wrong. I mean, there are obviously competing crises at this point. But that's, from our perspective, that's what we're going to be pushing for, is to at least propose this idea, and if it falls on deaf ears, then we'll keep trying. But the progress that has been made is not meeting the need for the Iraqis who have helped us. And I initially got involved in this because of one friend of mine who was photographed walking out of the green zone one day by a chewer, which is this member of a militia that their sole function is to try to identify Iraqis who are working for the Americans and to target them for assassination. When he went home the next day, he found the severed head of his dog on his front steps with a note pinned to it saying that his head would be next. And when he brought this threat to USAID, there was nothing that was done for him. They offered him 2 months unpaid leave, at which point they told him they would give his job away. So in effect, basically firing him in slow motion. Now, he has since made it to the U.S. He lives with my parents in West Chicago, Illinois, and he and his wife just received their green card 2 weeks ago, and they're doing great. And so on that front, I'm really pleased to see these meaningful victories. And there are, I think, at our last check, there are something. I think we're at around 350 Iraqis on my list that have now made it to U.S. soil, which we're proud of. But the reality is that surge or no surge, we're getting between 5 and 10 new applicants every single day applying to the list, and there are bureaucratic shortcomings that have so far prevented these Iraqis from being swiftly resettled here. And I'll leave it at that, but thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Kirk. So please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers who provided I think you all cumulatively have provided a compelling snapshot of the ways in which policies geared towards Iraqi refugees both have responded and have failed to respond to the realities of Iraqis on the ground in various parts of the world. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. And if I'd ask that anyone with a question please approach the mics located on either side of the room.
Go ahead. Good morning. I'm Brian Murphy. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you all for your wonderful work. I used to work in Baghdad on the resolution of property claims. I worked alongside colleagues with the Ministry of Displacement and Migration. And I guess I only know what I hear. And Kirk, you and I have talked when I was with the State Department after coming back, and you were so helpful when I received requests from colleagues for help. And Ms. Strack, it sounds to me like this has been a new day. And all I can say is I no longer work for the Department of State, and I'm very glad that you're working with DHS now, because we created so many problems in our efforts with so many perhaps unintended consequences. I'd like to pay tribute to Senator Kennedy, who was one of the few people in the U.S. government to whom I could turn when colleagues came to me for help, along with Kirk, who at the time was on his own. So I just want to say it's about time we do some of this, and I'm just very grateful for what is being done now. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, shlonakum, ismi Mike Springman. Andi Akthar min sual, but I'll try and compress the questions into one. So far, you all have been kind of like the Hindus describing the elephant, the guys with the blindfolds, and it's a trunk and it's a tail and so forth. But what it comes down to, really, is that the 4 million odd Iraqis who are displaced and who are refugees can't go home again because the country is poisoned by depleted uranium dust. The whole infrastructure of the country has been destroyed. And the Americans won't take them, and the Europeans won't take them, in large part because they're Arabs and because they're Muslims. Now, what's going to happen if we give them 70,000 visas a year? It will take 57 years for all the Iraqis to come to the United States, and that's almost as long as the Palestinians have been held in Israeli concentration camps. You know, who is going to focus on this and say this is a major issue, and the United States, at bottom, is the cause of it all? And we have to decide what we're going to do. Do you see any future movement. I mean, Obama talks a good game, but he has not done anything, and I don't see the rest of the government doing anything else because you need somebody to push these people. How can we do it?
Who wants to take that one? I'll take a stab. Thanks for your question. We clearly have the primary responsibility with respect to the refugee crisis. I think that, frankly, our entire efforts in Iraq have been plagued by wishful thinking. And when I was there, people within USAID would focus on the one water plant that was functional, and we would go do all these press junkets to that. And you do that enough, and you start to really think that there is clean water that's coursing through Iraq when there, in fact, wasn't. I think that with respect to the refugee crisis, the mantra has been in the last 2 years that the surge has worked, and it has patently reduced day-to-day violence, but it concurred with what I think was a great deal of sectarian cleansing and purification of different neighborhoods, and the ethnic makeup of Baghdad has changed substantially over the last 18 months. But my understanding and my sense on all of this was that because the surge worked, all of these Iraqis could go home, and it's out of the question that we would resettle 4 million Iraqis, our country, and I mean, even I would say that. And frankly, I don't think all of them would want to come here either. The ultimate solution is for the vast majority of these Iraqis to return. A lot from what I hear from the Iraqis on our list, they don't have homes to return to anymore. They may have the keys, but a different sect owns their house now, or a different militia has taken over it. I think that we could do better with respect to the ones that can't return anytime soon, whether or not the trend lines continue to subside. The Iraqis who have worked for us have been stigmatized for at least a generation, I would guess. And so I do think that we need to move more swiftly. But, I mean, the region is still reeling from the last refugee displacement 50 years ago. So I don't know if that gets to what you said or not.
If I can add just one little thing. I mean, the Iraqi government has to step up and do what needs to be done for Iraqis, both in Syria and Jordan. Jordanians, for political reasons, are concerned that the Iraqis are going to turn into another Palestinian refugees and are going to threaten, that's their thinking, they're going to threaten the fabric of the Jordanian society. That's the way they see it. They don't want that to happen. The Iraqi government is doing very little for Iraqis in Jordan and for Iraqis in Syria. And it is their role to step up and do more. I mean, it's an oil. This is not Lebanon or the Palestinians. Very poor and government. One is under occupation. The other one has very little means to do for their citizens. Iraq is a very wealthy country. It's an oil-rich country, and they can do a lot for their citizens. They are not doing much.
The only other thing I'd like to add is just descriptively, it is not accurate to say that the U.S. refugee resettlement is not resettling Arabs or not resettling Muslims. I mean, amongst the Iraqi population, as you mentioned, it is multi-sectarian. It is Sunnis and Shia and Christians and Mandeans and Sabaeans. But the Iraqis do represent a large percentage of the overall refugee resettlement program, and certainly a growing percentage.
My name's Linda Rabin. I work for a project called Refugee Works, which is funded by the U.S. Office of Refugee Resettlement and based at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which is one of 10 voluntary agencies that actually run the resettlement program in the United States. And there is one person missing from the panel, and that's someone from Office of Refugee Resettlement or someone who's involved in actually resettling Iraqis and other refugees. And I think there are many problems with the U.S. resettlement program. that need to be addressed. I'm not sure if anyone on the panel is familiar with it, but it is grossly underfunded, and it is very difficult for the voluntary agencies to do their job. And I have had the privilege of talking to several Iraqi refugees, professional people, who are having a tremendous struggle in resettling in the United States and trying to navigate an obstacle course. And I'm hoping that the incoming administration will do something about this, and that the organizations that you all represent will educate our legislators so that they fund these efforts more adequately. And I don't know if someone on the panel can talk about the resettlement program. Thank you.
Since I'm the only U.S. government representative on the panel, I'll respond, although you're right. The Department of Homeland Security is, we aren't part of the resettlement process per se once refugees get here. That responsibility lies initially with the State Department, the Office of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and then, as you say, it transfers, sort of segues to the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the Department of Homeland Security. And I can't speak for them. What I can say is I know that they are well aware of the funding challenges, and in particular the challenges that this economy presents for refugees who are striving and struggling to become self-sufficient, and the VOLAGs who are struggling to help them become self-sufficient quickly. And so I know those conversations are being had about the funding needs for refugee resettlement within the State Department and in Office of Refugee Resettlement.
I might just add a couple of notes, but it's my understanding that I don't think that the resettlement side, in terms of what happens to them once they get here, I don't think that that's been seriously reconsidered or reassessed in several decades, 2 or 3 decades or so, and I think that is severely needed. It's just we're in a very unfortunate moment right now in our nation's history where you're not going to find many sympathetic ears on the street, at least, towards upping our portfolio of assistance to new refugees. I mean, I think every time an economy goes south, there's an increase in anti-immigration fervor, and I don't think we're going to be unique to that in this situation. Under that pragmatic framework, what we've been trying to do with the Iraqis who have made it here is mobilize American volunteers who have written to us over the last couple of years and want to help, because American citizens and the churches and the different religious communities, they all know how to help people. They just need to be connected with them, and they need to be asked to do that. It's a stopgap. I think that we should probably be able to do more than a couple $100 a month for a few months once these Iraqis get here. And the only other thing I would mention is that the program is really not designed to work with highly educated refugees, and the majority of Iraqis on my list have at least a BA and are, working in quickie marts across the country right now. But I don't know if that helps answer.
Great. Due to time constraints, we'll only be able to take about 3 more questions, but I encourage those of you who don't get a chance to formally ask the questions to come up afterwards.
Hi, my name is Janice Kelsey. I am a volunteer with the LIST project Netroots. Netroots with the LIST project is a social networking site to help resettle Iraqi allies. I promised one of our members, Sabah, who cannot be here today, that I would read this for him. I am an Iraqi interpreter with a BA in English from Baghdad University. I was among the first of Iraqi locals to work with the U.S. Army as an interpreter beginning in May of 2003. For a period of 3 years until February of 2006, I worked in many positions. I worked as an interpreter and, in addition, was a staff writer for 3 newspapers that were run by me and a fellow interpreter. At the newspaper, I translated articles from Arabic into English and vice versa. I also worked as an on-air radio personality doing multiple jobs of production, announcer, and DJ. At the radio station, I communicated with the local people, explaining what was happening and working with them to try to prevent acts of terrorism by reporting suspicious behavior. In addition to all this, I carried out over 500 humanitarian projects helping the poor of Iraq by delivering food and supplies to them. Many of these projects I carried out unassisted by U.S. forces. In November of 2005, everything changed for me. One of my fellow interpreters was assassinated by militias, and I was also targeted and threatened. In February of 2006, I was forced to request an indefinite leave of absence due to credible and serious threats on my life and also the lives of my family. Even my brother and sister were affected and were unable to continue with their schooling because they were labeled as relatives of a traitor. From this time on, I was unable to return to work because of militias and other terrorists trying to locate me. I was forced into hiding not only for my safety but also for my family's well-being. From that time on until the present, I have contacted newspapers, TV stations, radio stations, and many organizations, but nothing worked. Then, in January of 2007, one of my former bosses contacted me in an effort to help. For an entire year, he worked with various people in Washington, D.C., trying to secure a move to the U.S. for me and my family. Nothing worked. And finally, in December of 2007, I decided to apply for an SIV. In January of 2008, my case was approved, and I was told by the NVC that a visa was available for me. Then, a month later, the NVC informed me that they had temporarily suspended scheduling of all SIV cases until they had determined how many SIVs had been issued. I was told in March that my case was not one of the 485 cases scheduled for interview. They also informed me that if they were unable to schedule my case in the fiscal year of 2008, my case would remain at the NVC until a visa number would become available. On July 15, 2008, the NVC informed me that my case had been documentarily completed and is currently under review for the required security checks. And they added, as soon as we receive the required security checks and an interview appointment is scheduled for you, you will be notified via email. It is now 3 years that I have been forced into hiding and unable to work. Many people here in Iraq are suffering under these harsh conditions. But despite all the suffering I have been through, along with my family, I have not given up. I still believe in the U.S. and have faith that the people of the U.S. will help. I hope that the people in the NVC will be able to speed up the processing of my paperwork and help me and the many like me who have been waiting for what seems like forever. We have all been through so much as a result of supporting the U.S. in this war and supporting the spread of democracy in our country. Now we hope that the U.S. will support us and help us to reach safety and be able to start a new life. I wait for the day that my children will be able to play as other children do without fear. For 3 years now, I feel as if I have been in prison, and I am impatient to be released. The waiting is very hard. Now, in addition to that, since January of this year, 3 interpreters have been assassinated in Iraq. Sabah recently had to move to another hiding place due to the most recent one. He sent his wife and children elsewhere. This morning, I received an email from Dana Choi, Sabah's attorney, that she's been communicating with the NVC yesterday, and they have told her only that there appears to be conflicting information in Sabah's documents. Now, my question is, how can we address conflicting information if we don't know what that information is?
I have to apologize. I work specifically with the Refugee Resettlement Program. I don't work with the SIV program and the National Visa Center, but we'll talk to my State Department colleagues and get you some advice about how to proceed.
Please go ahead.
I'm Bob Kramer, Program Director of International Medical Corps. First, I'd like to congratulate Kirk and the project for the incredible work that it does. Having worked at USAID for decades, I understand how much danger our FSNs are placed in. So I really applaud the work that you do. IMC has a very large program inside Iraq since 2003, and we're in 14 governance. And it seems that the funding for displaced population in Iraq is fairly generous. We also have programs addressing the needs of refugees in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And the primary health care needs, mental health care needs, continuing education. But the funding is less generous. And we are a bit concerned that although the needs, will continue and will not dissipate, for the refugees. The funding is very short-term, and we're a little concerned about donors continuing to fund programs for these basically forgotten people to a large extent. And I know, Michelle, you mentioned that. You're concerned also. I just don't know how we can all address it. Thank you.
Everyone's looking at each other. I think well, I want to say something that's not really directly addressing your question, but I mean the notion of the funding has come up. Well, first of all, I don't know what the projections are for humanitarian assistance in Iraq over this coming year, and maybe, yeah. I imagine Ambassador Foley can touch on that. I don't know if this is the place to bring it up, but the funding is reflective of sort of these bizarre occurrences that happen within the process. I don't know do you know how IMC has been funded in Iraq? Was it through a grant or a cooperative agreement from aid?
Grants from State Department, from PRM, OFDA primarily.
But not contracts?
No contracts, no.
So this is something that, I mean, I think sort of illustrates the frustration that we've been having, is that there is good intentions, there's congressional intent. There have been the SIV legislation was intended to admit 5,000 Iraqis. In theory, the Iraqis, like those on my list every year, through this special immigrant visa that would then sort of free up the normal processing queues for the other refugees. And they've fallen far short of those numbers. I think last year there were around 600 or so SIVs that were granted, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of the bizarre things that we're finding is that there's been an interpretation by the legal affairs section of the State Department that interpreted the Kennedy and the SIV legislation to mean that only direct hires and only contractors are eligible for SIVs. But if you, like IMC, if you're Iraqis, if they worked for you, they received their pay through the vehicle of a grant or a cooperative agreement. There's no really substantive difference within the way that, I mean, it's U.S. money, basically. It's just different reporting mechanisms. But what that means is that we haven't crunched the exact numbers, but it means that almost half of the Iraqis on our list are going to be ineligible for SIV under this interpretation. And I don't think any reasonable person could look at the legislation and think that that's the intent. But currently, we're in this kind of bizarre situation where somebody who's worked for KBR is eligible, but somebody who worked for NDI isn't. And I know that it's not Embassy Baghdad, it's not the people within the State Department that are focusing on the refugee thing. I think they're frustrated by it too, but there are these, to me it speaks to a lack of clear leadership on the top that I'm hoping the new administration will address. I know that didn't directly answer your question.
No, but I'm glad you made the point.
Very briefly, I don't have an answer to your question, but we share exactly the same concerns. And one of the danger in the equilibrium we have to play now with what's happening in Iraq, with some returns taking place, is that some donors, and I'm not really concerned by the U.S. contribution, I think it will remain solid, but some donors are taking advantage of that to say we must not maintain what little we've given in asylum countries, because this would precisely Palestinize the situation and encourage people to stay. And our view is the contrary, is that there is still a lot of misery in asylum country, and if returns have to be supported, we are far from the situation where we can advocate for return, and where we should still be concerned that if returns take place too quickly, they might contribute to destabilization of the progress we have seen. So that as much as we have to be involved with those who want to return voluntarily, we want this to take place progressively, so that the process is built up as it can be sustained by efforts of the Iraqi government. So we have the same concern, and we advocate that position as strongly as we can. What will be the result by mid-year or the end of the year, I don't know.
Michelle, did the Iraqi government ever actually give you the $25 million they promised a couple years ago?
Gave them to neighboring countries. But I think there's been a lot of discussion on the, whether the Iraqi government should contribute to neighboring states. And one of the issues that is coming to the fore now is that if they did that, it could be interpreted as we put money so they stay there. And that therefore may not be to their advantage. And I think what we should do is rather to try to make sure that the Iraqi government puts what it has passed in terms of legislation and funding to effective use inside Iraq. And this is where there is still a gap between decisions in Baghdad and what happens in the field. And I think we must all try to strive to help the government in making this efficient.
I thank you all.
I just quickly want to ask a question to go back to the resettlement issue of Iraqis in the United States. Is there any oversight program regarding the different resettlement agencies? Because from when Iraqis are coming here to the States, they're often told, that they'll have 6 months assistance, that they'll have English language lessons, things like that. And it's very different depending on where they get sent in this country, and it can be as little as 30 days up to 90 days. Some are given 4 months, but that's very rare. And what they receive, whether it's language assistance, that's also very kind of here or there. And I know it's a lot of different organizations, but the fact that we can have friends come here and after 30, 60, or 90 days get a 3-day notice saying you have to get out of the apartment, and also only have their gas and electric paid for 1 month. When they've come, because they're not coming directly from Iraq, they're coming from a second country where they've already expended their resources. And what they're being told overseas, I mean, we've had this with many, many people. They're told something different, and they just want to know, what is it in fact when I go there? They're willing to work at any job. They know it's going to be difficult in the beginning, et cetera. And as you're saying, I mean, Iraqis coming are much more highly educated than some other groups, et cetera, so there's issues. But what they're being told overseas, and then when they get here, and where they can wind up falling through the cracks in very short order, and it doesn't seem like there's any oversight or any, kind of programming that looks at what happens once they're here, and it's quite dangerous because we have friends who, other than friends getting money together, would have wound up falling through the cracks, and that's not the exception, that seems to be the, it can happen a lot more than we think.
I can address a little bit of that. And there are colleagues from the room from PRM. I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand and maybe talk to you during one of the breaks. Larry Bartlett is sitting just behind you. PRM is responsible for the placement and reception, I guess, side of the program. I mean, my simple understanding is that there is, in fact, a standard that is required of the voluntary agencies who work to resettle in the United States. And some provide that minimum baseline level, and some are able to provide enhancements on top of that. I happen to have sat in a cultural orientation class in Amman, and I heard that the day I happened to be there, that was part of the lesson plan, saying that you all are about to be resettled, you're going to go to different places, and you're going to find different levels of service depending on where you go. You're all going to have the baseline. Some people will have more above the baseline, and some people will get the baseline. So what I can tell you from my perspective is that's kind of my understanding of the general system. I know that there's some effort, certainly in Amman, to communicate that through the cultural orientation process. But I should defer to my PRM. Well, and I can also say I know that there is a monitoring program that goes along with the resettlement program. But other than that, I think the colleagues from PRM can give you more details.
The only other thing I would add is that, I mean, I think a lot of Iraqis have been coming over with these milk and honey notions of America that you just have to go knock on the first door and you'll find your $100,000 a year job. And that obviously isn't the case. And so I think what we've seen happen now is, and I should also say that I think their expectations have been colored by what they're hearing from their friends who have made it to Sweden and to other countries in Scandinavia, which do have pretty generous levels of assistance. I think now the pendulum is sort of swinging back in that I get emails from Iraqis in the region who have sort of through the echo chamber heard that Iraqis become indentured servants here and things like that that need to be dispelled with proper orientation. But I mean, yeah, the first 3 or 4 months of every Iraqi arrivals here, from what I've seen, is pretty brutal, and most of these Iraqis are going through heavy PTSD, and so it's a little difficult for them to go through the trauma that they've just gone through and now, you know, clean up their resume and go do the American job interview and all of that. But that's where we've been trying to sort of plug the gaps imperfectly where we have, but the Netroots have been great with that. Sorry.
Thank you. One final round of applause for our panels, please.